I taxied close behind him to the start. Visibility was appalling, and the green flare path lights could hardly be seen through the thick, rain-lashed perspex. The CO took off. The engines roared, and a dense rain of sparks swirled in the slipstream behind him. He had hardly left the runway than I gave my machine full throttle and streaked after him. All my nerves were concentrated on this takeoff. I soon got up speed, pulled her off the ground, and retracted my undercarriage. Just as I was about to retract my wing flaps, a terrible explosion shook my machine, and a scarlet flame pierced the night. I was half dead with fright. For a second, I thought that my machine had crashed, but nothing could have happened, for the altimeter showed 90 feet, and I was in level flight. Then the truth struck me in a flash. Hauptmann Beer had crashed. I stared grimly at my instruments and gained height. Now I must on no account let my mind wander. At 3,000 feet, the propellers and the leading edges of the wings began to ice up. I realized this at once from the irregular running of the engines. Marley lit up the wings with his torch. There was already a thick coating of ice. We were now at a dangerous height in which the temperature outside was about 0, and the sleet was turning to ice on the undercooled machine. Everything happened at lightning speed. As a precaution, I told the crew to check their parachutes and to bail out as soon as I gave the orders. The machine grew heavier, and the controls answered more slowly each moment. I now had to decide whether I should take her down into a warmer belt of air or hold on and try to fly through the danger zone. To lose height would in practice mean the end of the operation, and furthermore entail the danger that, with any further icing, we should be too low to bail out. I therefore decided to go on climbing and to wait and see whether the machine would make the grade or not. The engines were running at full throttle. Thick ice splinters broke off with loud reports and thumped against the nose. Mahler reported, "Herr Oberleutnant, it's pointless. The tail unit's beginning to ice up. The temperature outside is now 4 degrees below." I noticed that my joystick was no longer answering. Fortunately, the trimming wheel was still working. I set the machine at tail heavy and pushed the throttle home to its utmost limit. The engines could rev like this for 5 minutes at the utmost. But why should I spare the engines when it was a question of the crew's life? I remembered the English bomber formation, which in the winter of 1943 iced up over the North Sea and, as a last resort, jettisoned bombs, equipment and petrol in the sea to lighten the machines. And yet they could not reach the safety height, and more than 44 engined bombers crashed like gigantic lumps of ice into the icy waters. No rescue was possible. Would the same thing happen to me? Our last chance was to bail out, but it was not very pleasant in this sort of weather to jump into the unknown, so I must go on climbing. All eyes were riveted on the wings. The machine was almost on stalling point, but at last we were out of danger. The layer of ice gradually broke off. My good old me. 110 was now climbing faster, and the temperature outside sank to 15 degrees below. The danger of icing was past, but there still remained the darkness and the impenetrable cloud bank around us. The altimeter showed 6,000 feet, but not until 12,000 did we catch a glimpse of the stars. God be praised, we had won through. Now, above us, was a cloudless sky with bright stars such as one only sees on clear winter nights. I skimmed the clouds, heading for the Baltic coast, and waited for further orders. I almost felt like patting my me. 110 as though she had been a human being. I wondered what could have happened to Hauptmann Beer and his crew. How could he have crashed? I thought of Kamprath and his family. They could not have got away with it, for they could not have been at more than 200 feet. This was far too low to bail out. My thoughts were interrupted by an order from the ground station. "White Argus from Meteor. Achtung, Achtung. Strong bomber formation at 15,000 feet over the Baltic, flying on a southwesterly course." Above Wismar, my radio operator caught the first enemy machine in his SN2. The magic began. At 20:36, the first enemy bomber was brought down and spun through the clouds after my first burst. 20 minutes later, a second crashed just outside the capital. The British drew a square above the clouds with their parachute flares. We could see nothing of the city below. Thousands of flak bursts confirmed our arrival over the target. Wave after wave of bombers flew across the square of light and dropped their loads within this area, through the cloud onto the city. I approached this square on a southerly course and spotted a couple of 4-engined Lancasters directly above the target. After a short attack, the first bomber exploded and fell in burning debris through the clouds. The second banked steeply to starboard, trying to escape. The Tommies fired at me with all their guns, framing my aircraft with gleaming tracers. I pressed home the attack. The tail unit grew ever larger in my sights. Now was the time to shoot. The firepower of my guns was terrific. My armour-piercing shells riddled the well-protected wing tanks and the pilot's armoured cockpit. The tracers set fire to the petrol, and the HE shells tore great holes in the wings. It was no wonder that my fourth bomber that night crashed in flames. I was all in. 4 kills in 45 minutes were too much for the nerves. The raid was over, and the enemy bombers were on their way back to England, protected by the cloud bank. I circled for about 10 minutes to calm down. Only then did I begin to think, now, where am I to land? The ground stations continued to give the weather reports. There were nearly 40 night fighters in the air, all anxious to see terra firma once more. The weather report was calamitous. Nearly all the airfields reported a ceiling of 150 feet, bad visibility and snowstorms. What was to be done? My crew was sitting there, half frozen. "Go through that again, Herr Oberleutnant," said Mahler. "No, it's better to get above Parchim and fall out of the sky like Father Christmas." I could not countenance this suggestion to abandon my machine. Since Leipzig Brandes had reported that the clouds were now at 240 feet and nearly all the machines would be landing there, I decided to fly back to Parchim. There I knew every hillock, every tree, and every house. My crew was exhausted and silent. This disturbed me. I flew for 30 minutes above the cloud at 15,000 feet and reached our home field. I got into communication with control. The familiar voice of the controlling officer replied. At first he wanted to know some details of our kills. He's worried, I thought. He's standing with both feet on the ground while we still don't know whether we can make a safe landing. But I could understand his curiosity, for even a Kiwi gets excited by the success of his pals after sitting alone all night at his post. 4, I replied. Victor, Victor. Message received, he replied. 1, 2, 3, 4, shot down. Congratulations. Take great care on landing. Ceiling 150 feet. Snow has ceased. I'm putting out the shroud and firing radishes. Reception good. So down we went into the muck. Putting out the shroud meant pointing the ground searchlight vertically to light up the clouds. At 450 feet over the airfield, I should have to spot this searchlight. Slowly we circled round the beacon, losing height. At 4,500 feet, the machine started to ice up again. To get out of the danger quickly, I throttled back and dived sharply to 1,500 feet. It worked. The icing ceased. But now came the ticklish point, the landing. We were now losing height at 3 feet per second, feeling our way carefully through the clouds, constantly losing height. It was still pitch dark around us. Then suddenly I saw lights flash. They could only be the radishes, and a moment later the shroud appeared, so we were directly above the airfield. In a flat turn I got into position to land and switched over to the bark approach position. The ultra-short-wave bark approach was still the safest way of landing blind. To port of the flying-in course echoed dots and to starboard dashes. If we were on the right course, I should hear a sustained burr in the headphones, and moreover control lamps went on. Taking into consideration the wind conditions, I was now flying in the region of the sustained tone towards the airfield. About 1.5 miles away from the field, I lowered my undercarriage and wing flaps and came down to 150 feet. My run-in was good, the controlling officer reported for the last time. Your course correct, you can land. I confirmed the report and told him to turn off the searchlight. Throttled back to stalling point, we approached the airfield and now no lights were visible. Then the warning signal rang out. Pip, 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 pip. So I was 2,500 yards from the runway. I set the wing flaps at 70 degrees and kept an approach speed of 100 mph. This flight position was very dangerous and mobile. If I missed the runway, it would be fatal. Finally, I saw blurred lights on the horizon, and the signal rang out, "Da da da da." Now we were 300 yards from the airfield. At that moment, I recognized the flare path and put the machine down at far too great a speed. I did not think we should ever stop. Touched down at last and taxied towards the red end field lights. I braked like a maniac and pulled up just on the edge of the open country. I said a little prayer now that I was down again. Marla pulled open the cockpit and we could all breathe the cool night air. The mechanics were all delighted. They were always proud of their machines and their crews, but news of the death of Hauptmann Bär and his gunner dampened the joy of the other crews who had been on ops. "And what about Lieutenant Kamprath?" I asked. "Can you imagine it?" was the reply. "He bailed out from 240 feet. What a bit of luck. Hardly had the parachute opened than he hit the ground. It was a matter of about 10 seconds. He's already recovered." "What a crazy business," I replied as I hurried over to the ops room. Brinos was already in a happy state of mind. On the one side joy and on the other side grief. But we had grown. Hard in this pitiless war. Hauptmann Bär was dead, and he was not our only casualty. Lieutenant Sorko and Oberfeldwebel Kammerer had been shot down with the crews and were dead. After Bade Singh, Lieutenant Spoden bailed out with his crew and landed successfully. On landing, he had a little misadventure, and his account made us all roar with laughter. Spoden recounted the event in the following manner. My crate grew heavier and heavier. Thick lumps of ice formed on the wings and the screws. "I'm no flying refrigerator," I said to my mates and showed them a little break in the clouds. It had come to that. The aircraft was out of action, and I thought we'd better bail out. At first my crew wouldn't hear of it, so I said, "Well, boys, if you don't want to, I bid you all good night. Peter's jumping." You can imagine how fast they were. Hoopla number 1, hoopla number 2, and I followed them. It was as cold as in Siberia, and I remember thinking that it was a good thing I had put on Mother's warm woolen socks. Well, how shall I describe what happened then? It was as dark as in the jungle, and I had a feeling that I should soon be down. You wouldn't credit it. My descent lasted an eternity. Suddenly there was a jerk, as if someone had put on the brake, and I was left hanging and swinging in the air. My parachute had got caught up in a tree. At first I was pleased that I had got down safely, but unfortunately there was no one to tell me how far I was from the ground. I'd lost my torch as I'd bailed out, of course. I was scared stiff to slip out of the lift webs and jump down. Then I found my knife in my left pocket. I took it out, let it fall, and listened. Flop. It could have been 6, but it could have been 30 feet. I had no confidence in this test and waited for dawn. It was amusing at first, swinging about in the tree, but it soon palled. My limbs grew as stiff as pokers. I prayed that it would grow light, but nothing happened, so I hung on my belt and waited longingly for the first light of day. As soon as dawn broke, I woke up from a doze and looked at the ground. My eyes nearly started out of my head. Hardly 3 feet below me was a wonderfully soft forest floor. That was the end of Peter's story. We roared with laughter, and Peter's tree landing went the rounds of the whole night fighter arm. Shortly after this, Peter Spoden and Lieutenant Kneeling were both in Parshim Hospital. The 2 men had been wounded in a night combat. I visited them one Sunday morning just as the chief doctor was making his rounds. I had to wait a little. As a result of the strangely peaceful atmosphere in the hospital, I grew thoughtful and stared out of the window up at the blue sky. The contrast between day and night is fantastic. Hardly 12 hours ago, it was once more an inferno over Berlin. 1,200 Allied bombers attacked in wave after wave, pouring burning phosphorus to relight the fires which had been extinguished in the grievously wounded capital. That night of 15th to 16th February 1944, I shot down my 13th, 14th and 15th opponents. But what did 15 four-engined bombers shot down mean? An individual success, that was all. With the destruction of Berlin, the crisis of the Nazi dictatorship began, for this round-the-clock bombing exhausted the civilian population. Even those who had firmly believed in victory began to doubt. What a contrast between the events of the previous night and the peace reigning here in Parchim. The patients were reading the accounts of the terror attacks on Berlin in the papers, but who could have any concept of the extent of these attacks? I myself could not grasp it, or that a proud initial success had become a bitter struggle to preserve the fatherland. My thoughts were interrupted by a sister who told me with a smile that I could visit my friends. Kneeling lay pale and apathetic in his bed. The poor fellow had a bullet through his thigh. With his last strength, he had managed to land before fainting from loss of blood. Now he was on the way to recovery. Our indestructible Spoden was wreathed in smiles. He wanted to get out of the hospital and fly again, but the house surgeon would not hear of it and informed me that Spoden would be released as unfit for flying. Peter winked at me when he heard this. As soon as we were alone, he hopped out of bed and fetched a bottle of brandy which his orderly had hidden in his locker. "Prosit! See you soon again with the squadron. When I'm out of here, you know what the quack can do. Do you suppose I'm going to stay on the ground while all this is going on?" I promised Spoden that I would fetch him as soon as possible and let him keep his hand in on a joyride over Denmark. The promise was soon fulfilled. Peter reported gaily from the hospital, and on the following day I took him up. I borrowed a two-seater Focke-Wulf 184 from the old junk shop in our air park. Brynos acted as wireless operator, and Peter was stowed away in the luggage hold. To avoid any danger, we hedge-hopped over Lake Schwerin, the Baltic and the Little Belt to the Danish airfield Aalborg. Denmark, despite 5 years of war, was still a land of milk and honey. It would do no harm to stock up our private larders. At 12:50 hours we landed at Aalborg. Brynos took our papers to the base commandant and drew the necessary krone. He soon came back beaming. A glance at his full note case, and we drove in an Opel in high spirits to the town. We ordered cream tarts in a pretty little cafe. Since we had not eaten such a thing for a long time and they were likely to upset our stomachs, we washed them down with plenty of brandy. At the next table, 2 pretty girls were obviously amused at our appetites and seemed friendly enough. Peter went over to the attack. Who could blame him? The 2 girls were soon sitting at our table and found him extremely amusing. An appointment was soon fixed for a round of the dance halls and bars that evening. Peter was in such good form that he would have liked to remain a few days in Aalborg. The following morning at breakfast, all suffering from thick heads, we realized we had bought nothing for our larder in Parchim. Brynos counted our communal wealth. We still had plenty of krone left. Armed with 2 kit bags, we visited the shops. Within 2 hours they were full of ham, bacon, chocolate, coffee, schnapps, cigarettes, and jam. But we still had some money left. What was to be done? We fetched our Opel and drove to the airfield, where we found a canteen. As we entered, we noticed a gigantic ham hanging from the roof. Peter immediately went over to the barman and asked what the bear's arse cost. The man goggled at us and could not believe that we really wanted to buy the whole ham, which must have weighed 100 weight. But Brynos plonked our last krone down on the table, and we were allowed to carry off our booty. But what were we to do with all our purchases? The good old Focke-Wulf had hardly room for 3 people, and certainly not for 3 kit bags full of food. But we had to manage somehow. At 18 hours when we took off, Peter was lying with a bottle of cognac in the luggage hold, hugging his bear's arse. He could not put on his parachute, for there was no room. "What's the use?" said Peter. "If we fall in the drink, the bacon will surface, and I shan't let go of it." At 20 Towers, we landed with our valuable food reserves in Parchim. We were received with as much excitement as though we had been the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Wherever there is bacon, there are always rats. A few days later, Peter came in the evening to the ops room and asked permission to fly. The CO shook his head, and Peter retired with a resigned air. At 21 hours, readiness was ordered, and a few moments later, all the machines were airborne. As we left the pens, I recognised, in the searchlight beam, Peter and his radio operator hovering round the machines. I suspected nothing and took off. Only when I was on my way to Berlin did I think, I wonder if Peter's done anything off his own bat. He's not fit to fly yet, and if the CO says no, he must accept the fact. The Tommies came over that night in good fine weather. The operation seemed to promise success for both the attack and the defence. Already on the approach flight, the bombers were brought down out of the sky like ripe fruits. Over Berlin, the defence was at its peak, and 120 out of the 800 bombers did not return home. Sweating profusely after 3 hours flying, I landed at Parchim after streaking across the airfield, dipping my wings as a sign of victory. There was great excitement at headquarters. All the crews had reported kills, and there were no casualties. The interrogations lasted interminably. Then Control Tower suddenly called, asking if anyone knew details of C9 Heyen, which had not returned. No one knew. This aircraft belonged to my squadron and was posted on the board as a reserve machine. I called up the chief mechanic and asked what had happened to it. The NCO had taken off about 20 minutes after the others in the reserve machine. A fine surprise. The CO was furious, although in his heart he did not take Peter's insubordination amiss. The intelligence apparatus started to function, and within half an hour we had news. Spoden had not landed. He could no longer be in the air, for his fuel could not have lasted for more than 3.5 hours. The CO's anger vanished at this news, for he had a soft spot in his heart for Peter. What had happened to him? At this juncture, Flak Headquarters Berlin came on the line. The CO hurried to the telephone and kept stammering, "Jawohl, Herr Oberst." His face grew longer. Slowly he put down the receiver. "Spoden has been shot down right over the city. The searchlight battery had caught an enemy bomber in its cone at 17,000 feet when a night fighter suddenly attacked it. The Britisher replied to its fire, and within a matter of seconds both machines spun down earthwards on fire. The searchlight battery lit up the two machines down to 4,500 feet, and as they crashed, noticed a man hanging onto the tail unit. That could only have been Spoden. As a result of his wound, he no longer had the strength to tear himself free from the machine. Well, that's it, boys. He's paid for his obstinacy with his life. The moon was low. I could not believe it, and kept thinking of our flight with the giant ham over the Baltic. That simply can't happen to Peter, I thought. The good Lord will get him out of it somehow. Brinos agreed with me. We sat in our armchairs and waited for some real news one way or the other. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rang. It was Berlin Flak Division again. I seized the phone and breathed a sigh of relief. Spoden was badly wounded in hospital. His life was not in danger. His crew had all bailed out and landed successfully. Peter was brought back to Parchim on the following day. His bed in the hospital was still vacant. The house surgeon cursed him roundly, but immediately started to treat him. A few days later, when Peter was in a condition to speak, we heard his story. When you'd all taken off, I felt terribly lonely. Making up my mind, I ordered the Oberfeldwebel to get the reserve machine ready to take off. He hesitated, but I pointed out that in wartime orders were orders, and that I was now giving one. He obeyed me. It was over Berlin. I had put up some competition to the flak and shot down 2 Lancasters in the searchlight cones. I thought to myself, The main thing is to bring them down. Then the third one came into the beam, a short Sterling. You know, as big as a barn door with 4 engines. I attacked, and as I broke away noticed that my machine had been hit in the fuselage. Flames were coming out on both sides. I could get no reply from the radio operator. I gave the order to bail out, but he had already gone. Both his cockpit roof and mine had flown away. When I tried to get out, something caught me fast by the leg. Halfway out of the cockpit I had to return and tear something off. The flames were already licking my parachute. Well, prosit. Bad hats always seem to come through. My aircraft was spinning like a merry-go-round. Somehow I got out at 15,000 feet. I was more flung out than anything and crashed against the tail unit. I noticed that I was in a searchlight beam. The wind held me pressed against the tail. I waved my arms and legs and could not shake free either up or down, and the descent went on. Finally the machine spun in the opposite direction, and I was flung out to the rear. "Now keep cool," I said to myself. "Count 20 to 25 and then pull the ripcord." It turned with me on the end and one of the lines was torn. The fire, you know. Then I fell through smoke and flame and passed out. When I woke up, I lay in a street between blazing houses. The flak was still firing. I was carried into a cellar and given some brandy. Someone had been sweating with anxiety, the officer of the searchlight battery. He visited me next day in hospital. I learnt from him that I only broke free at about 5,000 feet. He thought that he was helping me by lighting me up. While the Battle of Berlin continued with undiminished fury, smaller RAF formations raided the other German cities. In this way, the enemy split the German defence and constantly set the German night fighter command a problem as to which was the main attack. At the beginning of March 1944, a medium-sized British formation appeared over France, heading for southern Germany. We were in our ops room following the progress of the bombers on the map. Our CO asked divisional headquarters for permission to take off. The division hesitated because it feared a simultaneous attack on Berlin. In this way, valuable minutes were lost. In the meantime, the leading formations had reached the Franco-German frontier in the Hagenau region. We now received orders to take off for southern Germany. It was already 02:00 hours when the last machines from Parchim streaked down the flare path and set a southerly course. At 15,000 feet over the Thuringia forest, the directing officer reported the first bombs on Stuttgart. The clock on my instrument panel showed 02:59 hours. Thus, we still had 45 minutes flying time before we reached the Swabian capital. By the time we reached Stuttgart, the British bombers had left, and huge fires bore witness to their work of destruction. Pursuit was pointless. For once the British bombers had dropped their load and were on the return journey. They were as fast as the German night fighters. This was not surprising, for we had been flying the same crates since 1940. 4 years previously, I had learnt night flying over Stuttgart in an Mi-110, Bertha series. At the time, it was a reasonably fast and handy destroyer aircraft. That day, I was circling in the same machine, Gustav series, over burning Stuttgart. Our night fighter machines had not grown any faster, but rather slower. So we flew back to Parchim without success after wasting thousands of gallons of costly petrol. On the return flight, the ground station gave us details of the night attack. 400 bombers had flown over Stuttgart and dropped an incredible tonnage of phosphorus, high explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. In the spring of 1944, the RAF's night attacks on the capital ceased. For the moment, the great destruction had come to an end. Everything in the Nature of War factory had been razed in daylight raids carried out by American Boeings. My night fighter wing had come out of the Berlin battle with flying colours. Within 6 months, we had shot down an entire group of 4-engined Halifaxes, Stirlings and Lancasters. In other words, about 100 bombers with the 800 members of their crews. Our own losses were pitiful. In these air battles, the following pilots and their crews met their deaths: Hauptmann Baer, Hauptmann Schöbel, Oberleutnant Soko, Leutnant Metz, Oberfeldwebel-Kammerer, Unteroffizier Horget and Unteroffizier Zawadka. A further 2 crews went down in flames and were seriously wounded. Thus, a complete night fighter squadron was lost in these combats over Berlin. After a few days' rest and convalescence, during which our wing was reinforced by young crews, we received orders to leave for Leipheim on the Danube. The uncertainty and panic in the war leadership was now having its effect on the operational pilots. Hardly had we set foot in Leipheim and got things in order than we were ordered to Kitzingen. We packed our things and took off. We arrived in Kitzingen just before dusk, like a swarm of locusts. Our crews brought a breath of fresh air into the peaceful training school atmosphere reigning there. Hardly had we got warm than new orders came through. Return to Leipheim, and the muddle continued. Report at once to Hagenau in Alsace. Our general staff could certainly think quicker than we flew, for the following day we were ordered back to Leipheim. However, it was good practice and gave our machines no time to get rusty. Finally, it seemed as though we were to remain at Leipheim. On this airfield, a branch of the Messerschmitt factory was still working, building jets. This new invention was of the greatest interest to us. The test pilots set out daily with great explosions along the runway, disappeared on the horizon, and in a few moments reappeared flying at 500 mph over the field. A gentle whistle in the distance, a terrific roar, and they were gone. The landings seemed breakneck and dangerous. The normal starting and landing runway for jet fighters should be at least 2,000 yards. The concrete runway in Leipheim was only 900. Thus every landing was a risk for both pilots and machine. Nevertheless, I found them most impressive. One day I drove over to the works to have a look at this wonder machine. I noticed that the Me-262 had 2 engines but no propellers. Furthermore, inside the engine casings were 2 turbines which caused a propulsion behind which it was inadvisable to stand. The flames that spurted from the turbine chambers commanded respect. I thought that any moment such an apparatus would explode, but I was obviously wrong, for the test pilots sat unperturbed in their cockpits and seemed to delight in these fireworks. I was very curious and asked the works manager for an explanation of the machine. That all seems quite simple, I thought, when he had finished his lecture. The first step was to press a button, and a small petrol engine began to purr quite harmlessly. This engine drove the turbines. When the requisite revs had been reached, the pilot injected J2, a weak distillate, into the petrol flow. This J2 reached the compressed heated air of the combustion chambers and ignited of its own accord. Sparking plugs were therefore superfluous. The turbine revs rose from 4,000 to 5,000 RPM. Another few drops of J2 and the crate hurtled off at 550 mph. In the air, the rev counter and the temperature had to be watched. Temperatures of more than 800 degrees in the combustion chamber could be dangerous, and it was then prudent to reduce the intake. By and large, it was a fine job. Duration of flight, 25 minutes. This bird could reach 18,000 to 21,000 feet within a minute. In a dive, it was twice as fast. "Why don't you get in and have a look at her from inside?" said the works manager. Without a thought, I swung myself into the pilot's seat. At that moment, I had not the slightest intention of flying, for I found the whole machine too weird. Gradually, I grew accustomed to the whine of the turbines and the long trail of fire which came out of the onion. This onion was at the rear of the turbine and served the same purpose as the mute on a jazz trumpet. When it closed up the hole, the air could not get out. The compressed air in a trumpet produces a very clear tone, but in a jet fighter it gives enormous forward propulsion. If the onion is opened, the air can escape and the recoil is diminished. In the case of a trumpet, this results in a dull tone. When the plane's turbines are running on the ground, the onion is wide open. From the cockpit, I gave no more throttle than with a piston engine. I merely had to open and close the onion. I gradually realized that this turbojet had great advantages over an ordinary piston engine. The turbines needed no warming up, and the machine was ready to take off as soon as the self-starter was used. Moreover, there could be no sparking plug or cooling troubles. Whereas flying with full throttle was forbidden in all piston-engined aircraft, it was normal in this new type. My fingers itched, and, as a veteran, I felt ashamed to get out of the machine without taking her up for a flip. The works manager uttered his views. "The country still needs you as a night fighter, and I'm afraid I've left my flying suit in Augsburg, Herr Oberleutnant." I had the chocks removed and closed the cockpit roof. The works manager jumped down from the wing. I had made up my mind. At the worst, if I got into trouble, I could use the catapult release and bail out. That must be quite a pleasure in daylight. One machine more or less did not matter very much now to the Luftwaffe. A swift glance at the instrument panel and I was streaking along the runway with the onion closed. In a matter of seconds I was approaching the end of the airfield. I pulled her off the ground at 160 mph. It was too soon, and the machine sank until she was barely off the ground. Once more my luck held good. Another few yards, and I should have been in the soup. At 240 mph I retracted my wing flaps. Now there was no more holding her. The airspeed indicator rose in a few seconds to 300, 360, 420, 520 mph. This was fast enough for me. I carefully opened the onion because of the high temperature. I was still not quite at my ease with the combustion chambers. At 1,500 feet I swept over Ulm and did a steep left-hand climbing turn as I arrived over the cathedral. It was not a climb. I was fairly shot into the blue sky. The cathedral grew smaller and smaller until it was a mere toy below, and my altimeter showed 15,000 feet. I'd like to run into a few Tommies now, I thought. It would be a pleasure. I looked upon this machine now as the eighth wonder of the world, and in my enthusiasm I dived and zoomed like a rocket, flinging her about all over the sky. Leipheim was now just below me. In a power dive, I pulled out just above the sheds and buildings and roared across the airfield at over 600 mph. This was strictly forbidden, but I could not have cared less. Suddenly I realized that I must get this miracle down on the ground, for I had been flying nearly 25 minutes. I took this landing very seriously. In a broad sweep, I reached Günzburg at the prescribed height of 900 feet for a landing speed of 220 mph. Slowly, I lowered the undercarriage and wing flaps and put her nose into the wind. By the grace of God, there was a fairly stiff breeze, which made landing easier. The speed decreased. At 200 mph, the crate was at stalling point, but I held her at this speed and glided down to within 100 yards of the White Cross line. My speed sank to 150. The wheels touched the ground at the very edge of the airfield, and once more I was rushing along the runway. This time I had to pull up before I reached the end of the field, or else I should come to a sticky end. I pressed with all my strength on the brake pedals. They answered. I suddenly had complete confidence in this machine and was delighted with my first solo on jets. But by night I preferred my slow old me. 1 to 10, so the onion by day and the throttle lever by night. The following midday I was sitting peacefully in Brinos's room, celebrating his birthday with a cup of coffee. His wife had come to pay him a visit. No wonder the coffee and cakes tasted so good. Our CO, Hauptmann Fehlerer, was away on duty, and I was in charge of the wing. The adjutant, Walter, reported a big formation of American bombers flying towards southern Germany. "Most unsporting of them to disturb us at our coffee," said Brinos, consoling his wife. But Frau Kamprath suddenly grew nervous and opened the window. In the distance we could hear the sinister familiar drone. This made Brinos nervous too. "Mummy," he said, "put your things on, take your suitcase and cross the Danube to be on the safe side." His wife hastily left the house while Brinos followed me to the dispersal pens. The machines were camouflaged. The whole ground staff had left the eyrie according to orders. The drone grew louder, and a glance to the west showed us that the bomber stream was flying on a direct course for Leipheim. "Get in the car!" I shouted and jumped in myself. I pressed the self-starter, but nothing happened. The batteries were down. We were standing between the machines. It was a ticklish position. I looked round for the best chance of getting clear of the carpet bombing. "Come on, Brinos, to the other side of the Autobahn. There are no sheds or machines there." We were soon running for our lives, but we were too late. We were still halfway across the runway when the leading American machines dropped the aimer. It fell in the field to the east of the runway. "Lie down," I roared to Brinos, and we crouched in the grass. A thunderstorm broke over our heads, and at each moment the whistle of bombs would begin. But nothing happened. Once more our luck had held. "Come on," I roared. "They're making another circuit. Their run-in wasn't good enough." The next wave was about 2 miles from the field, followed by others. We had to get out of this within a couple of minutes, or else we should be dead meat. Brinos ran with his short legs, and I followed him with my long ones. The formation was now over the field. This time the marker bomb fell into the Messerschmitt Works production shed, and there was a sinister rustle and whistling in the air. Like old soldiers, we lay in a ditch at the edge of the field with our heads buried in the ground. Crump, crump! A deafening explosion, and within a few seconds the pilot's eyrie was shrouded in a giant cloud of smoke. The Americans attacked in 10 waves. At each wave we slipped deeper into our watery ditch. "Better be dripping wet and alive than dry and dead," said Brinos. We thought that the bombs must have fallen very close to us, for the earth rocked. During a lull, I looked over to the airfield buildings and sheds. They were a blazing heap of ruins. The runway was still untouched. Then another wave flew directly in our direction. "It's the runway this time, Brinos. Let's hope they aim well, or we've had it." The bombs whistled down. As in our happy days of infantry training, we now lay flat in the ditch with our noses just out of the water. Deafening explosions as the runway was hit. Bits of concrete fell round our unprotected backsides. It would be all over if we got one of them on the head. I remembered the steel helmet which had lain for years unused and dusty inside my locker. I could have used it now, but we pilots always had a prejudice against steel helmets, gas masks, rifles, and hand grenades. So all I could do now was to think nostalgically of my steel helmet and protect the back of my head with my hands. The danger was soon over. We got out of our ditch like drowned dogs and laughed with glee. But our laughter was short-lived when we saw the mess that the Yankees had made. The sheds and buildings were ablaze, and hours later delayed action bombs kept exploding. The wrecks of about 60 jet aircraft lay there. The following day we packed up all we could rescue and left for Haguenau in Alsace. The crews travelled by train in all directions to fetch new aircraft. 2 days later, our wing commander could report that we were ready for action. The USAAF began to fly daylight raids with their B-17 and Liberator bombers in 1943. As a result of the Luftwaffe general shortage of fighter aircraft, night fighter crews were now ordered to fly by day too. This double burden led to irresponsible losses of highly trained specialized night fighter crews. Despite the valor of the Luftwaffe crews, the much slower Mi-110s and Ju-88s stood hardly any chance against the fast US escort fighters Mustang, Lightning, and Thunderbolt. Nevertheless, night fighters were successful in bringing down many US bombers by day, but this costly policy was soon discontinued. The aircraft manufacturer Dornier made a contribution to the night fighter arm by converting the Dornier 217 bomber into a night fighter. However, the mass of the night fighter force was made up of Mi-110s and Ju-88s. Wilhelm Jonen's crew by the tail of their Mi-110 with 14 night victories marked up. From the left, Killian, Jonen, Marle. Unteroffizier Walter Teubner, NJG-6, points to the latest victory marker on the tail unit of Joseph Kraft's Mi-110, Prince Wittgenstein by his Ju-88 with its numerous aerial victories. He had 86 confirmed ones up to his death in combat with a British night fighter on 21st January 1944. The most successful night fighter pilot, Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, 121 aerial victories, with Hans-Joachim Jabs, 45 aerial victories. Oberleutnant Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer by his Me-110. By the time this photo was taken, he had 47 aerial victories, and shortly before, on 31st December 1943, had been awarded the Knight's Cross. Together with Helmut Lent, Schnaufer would become the only other member of the night fighter arm to receive the diamonds to his Knight's Cross. A Ju-88 fitted with Fuji 212 Hirschgeweih radar. This equipment was very useful but increased air resistance, which cost speed. From 1943, the RAF introduced in ever-increasing numbers the excellent de Havilland Mosquito, a high-altitude fighter of part wooden construction, which escorted the bomber fleets, and in the role of long-range night fighter shot down many German night fighters. The Me-110 and Ju-88 only rarely caught up with the Mosquito on account of its much higher speed. 2 Lancasters flying over open country. The tail gunner's blister and the 366-heater MG dorsal cupola can be clearly seen. In common with the Me-110 and Ju-88, the Mosquito also had strong firepower at the nose of the fuselage. The Mosquito was capable of carrying the large aerial mine. After releasing it, the aircraft recovered its full capability in speed and maneuverability. This mine bears a Christmas message for the German leader. The Würzburg Riese Giant, was a milestone in the development of German airborne radar. However, the British developed countermeasures to disrupt its efficiency. This Ju-88 carries the SN2 radar against which the British used a disruptive transmitter. This was the beginning of electronic warfare, the embryonic stage of modern radar development. The Heinkel He-219 was conceived as a pure night fighter. Though a match for the fast Mosquito, it could not be produced in sufficient numbers. Mission conference at NJG-6 in spring 1944. From the right, Race, Brandt, Martin Becker, Lomacz. Major Reschke and the freshly decorated Oberleutnant Martin Becker return the salute of the paraded NJG-6. On 25 May 1944, Hauptmann Gerhard Friedrich, Oberleutnant Martin Becker, Feldwebel Günther Bahr and Feldwebel Karl Ludwig Johansen, all from NJG-6, were awarded the German Cross in gold. Hauptmann Fritz Graf and Oberleutnant Martin Becker in front of a Me-110 with fire extinguisher device fitted to a motor. Photo taken in May 1944. Oberleutnant Martin Becker of INJG-6 at a conference on the aerial situation. Oberleutnant Martin Becker, later one of the recipients of NJG-6 to be awarded the Oak Leaves. Becker's flying crew, mechanic Welsenbach, pilot Martin Becker, radio operator Karl Ludwig Johansen. And Me-110 being prepared for a mission. The supports of the hangar can be made out in the background. Obergefreiter Welsenbach, Oberleutnant Becker and Feldwebel Karl Ludwig Johansen in May 1944. Martin Becker in a nighttime conversation with his crew before the next mission. A familiar picture. Wilhelm Jönen, boarding his Me-110. Wilhelm Jönen as Hauptmann in spring 1945. He had been awarded the German Cross in gold on 23 July 1944. On the Echterdingen airfield in August 1944, Feldwebel Günther Bahr, on the left, is wearing his German Cross in gold on the pocket right side of the summer issue shirt. Towards the end of the war, a few Me-262 jet fighters were tested as night fighters, but were not decisive operationally. Despite all efforts by the German night fighter arm, one German city after another was reduced to rubble and ash. Seen here are some ruins in Frankfurt, Maine in 1945. The lurid fires of a burning city light the way for the night fighters. At 21:43 HRs on 16th March 1945, Hauptmann Wilhelm Jönen shot down a 4-engined bomber over Würzburg, the only success there of the night. The city was destroyed to a great extent, and the death toll was about 5,000 people. Award of the Knight's Cross on 28 March 1945 to Lieutenant Karl Ludwig Johansen, Hauptmann Becker's successful radio operator. Johansen participated in the shooting down of 59 enemy aircraft, including 3 of his own. Oberfeldwebel Günther Bahr on I-NJGH-6 being awarded the Knight's Cross on 28th of March 1945. After the end of hostilities, pilots received a typed resume of their military career. Shown here is the document issued to Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen, stamped and signed by Major Luthier, Squadron Commodore, on 5th May 1945. By the end of the war, many of Germany's cities lay in ruins on a grand scale. More than 500,000 civilians were killed in Allied air raids between 1940 and 1945, while countless others were injured or crippled, and millions of dwellings destroyed. Surviving German night fighter aircraft were coveted acquisitions for the Allies, who used them for test purposes. Only a few can be seen today in museums. On the evening of 28th April 1944, a mild spring breeze was blowing over Hagenau airfield. Was it the spring or our new surroundings which made us feel so relaxed? In any case, the crews were in splendid fettle. It may, of course, have been due to the little town of Hagenau itself. After an afternoon trip through our new garrison, we could all feel the French atmosphere. Everything was different, more light-hearted and charming. Each of us felt that something was in the air, and in this mood we met for our briefing at 21 hours in the ops room. The CO, too, was in a spring mood. I had rarely attended such a calm briefing as on that evening. It was as though we had all drunk champagne. One would have thought that a feast was being prepared at the headquarters of No. 3rd, Squadron of Night Fighter Wing No. 6, instead of a serious night's ops. Actually, we did not expect to be sent on a mission, for the weather was too fine. At 6,000 feet, a few clusters of cloud stood in the night sky through which the moon cast its silvery light. This weather was far too unfavourable for the Tommies, and we began to make our plans for a night off. Our adjutant had found a nice little boîte de nuit in Hagenau with music, sweet wine, and everything else that a night fighter could need. Rendezvous at 02 hours. It was late, but not too late, and at the moment it was only 22 hours. What was the old saying? So much can happen on a wonderful night in May. Outside on the airfield stood the brand-new machine which I had fetched from the Parchim sheds, my C9, ES, fitted with all modern comforts and refinements. Outwardly she looked a trifle virginal, for she was painted white from nose to tail, but the cannon muzzles looked far from innocent. Her new equipment included the Naxos apparatus, a greatly improved radar eye. If a British night fighter tried to creep up from behind in the pitch darkness, this apparatus lit up and gave due warning when he was 500 yards away. A quick change of course, and the pursuing Tommy had someone on his tail. In addition to this was an electric altimeter, also a fine invention. The radar was now first class. It invariably picked up the bomber at 6,000 yards and led the fighter on an Ariadne's thread to its prey. And finally, the armament. In front were 2 cannon and 4 machine guns, with a further 2 cannon pointing upwards, an innovation successfully introduced by my crews and now mass-produced by the Messerschmitt works. I was really proud of my C9. ES, and felt rather sorry that presumably I should not have an opportunity to put her through her paces that night. 10 minutes passed. At about 0:30 hours we were preparing to go off on our party chez Yvonne. No one thought of sleep. That night Brinos, our intelligence officer, was briefed as my wireless operator because my regular sparker, Grasshoff, was away on 4 days' leave. Brinos sat with my gunner, Oberfeldwebel Mahler, in a cosy corner. 10 minutes later, orders came through. All machines take off for the Nancy sector. A British bomber formation is approaching, making for southern Germany. What a pity! I was looking forward to going chez Yvonne, I said to the crew. Never mind, said Kamprath. Tonight I shall be in at my first kill. Mahler said nothing and busied himself as usual with his cannon and machine gun. He had superstitiously placed my officer's cap on the ammunition drum. At 0:48 hours we took off into a southwest wind for Nancy. At 6,000 feet, after flying through some light cirrus, we came out into a beautiful clear sky. Below us lay a vast field of cotton wool lit up by the moon. With this visibility, it was possible from a good position to see the enemy at 1,000 yards. It was 10 hours precisely by the time we reached our combat height of 15,000 feet. Brinos tuned into the ground station wave and learnt that the head of the British bomber stream was flying west of Nancy on a course south-southeast. In a few moments we should get the first contact in our radar. I circled west of the city and explored the night sky with my SN2. Brinos reported calmly, "Achtung! The first enemy zigzags have appeared. Turn slightly to port." The gyro compass showed 160 degree and changed on a slight left-hand turn to 130 degree. Brinos now reported, "Target about 2.5 miles ahead. Give her full gas." My C9 ES was very fast. Within a few minutes the distance was reduced to 1,000 yards. At any moment the enemy bomber must appear. I closed in until I could see the black shadow of the bomber. The British machine was flying peacefully, weaving slightly to avoid attack. I recognized the type by its wings, a 4-engined Lancaster. Brinos switched off his SN2 and concentrated on each phase of the ensuing air combat. Slowly, we stalked the bomber with the moon behind us, distance 200 yards. The British pilot must have spotted us, for he suddenly did a vertical turn to starboard to give his rear gunner a better chance to fire. I stuck on his tail. The perspex of the gunner's turret glittered in the moonlight. Just as I got it in the centre of my sights, he opened fire with all his guns. The glowworms shaved my machine, but with a slight pressure on the rudder, I slipped out of the danger zone. Now I was flying below him and approaching at elevator speed. In this way, the rear gunner could not fire at me, although the mid-upper gunner was still a danger. This time I would shoot first, of that I was certain. Slowly the long, narrow wings rose in the air. As soon as I could see the glowing exhaust pipes, I fired between the two engines. The enemy must have opened fire at the same moment, for his tracers hit my wings. I immediately took avoiding action. "The Tommy's on fire!" screamed Brinos into the RT, nearly deafening me. He was right. Flames were pouring from the trailing edge of the wing. But the crate continued to fly calmly on its way. Shall I give him another burst? I wondered, drawing closer. But the enemy was badly hit, and the greedy flames were glowing eerily in the darkness, lighting up the red, white, and blue circle. We were now flying close to the enemy, watching what would happen. One of the crew bailed out. For the fraction of a second, his body gleamed in the light of the flames before he fell into the yawning depths. One after another followed suit, and 8 men in all bailed out. It was high time, for a moment later the port petrol tank exploded and the machine hurtled to the ground, leaving behind it a long fiery tail. I did an aileron turn and watched the grandiose sight of the crashing Lancaster. The comet streaked down to the earth and disappeared through the bank of cloud. A few seconds later a column of flames lit up the night. This was the first kill of the night. My comrades must have watched it, for a few moments later a second bomber hurtled, burning out of the sky. I called my radio operator on the RT, but received no answer. I dipped my wings as a sign that I wanted to say something, but received no answer. Then I gave a hard kick on the rudder, and at last Brinos answered. By his voice, I realized that something was wrong. Both he and the gunner were obviously delighted. "Okay, carry on," said Brinos, immediately switching off. I was annoyed. I would forbid him officially to cut me off like this, and insisted on another reply. Brinos refused to be disturbed and said calmly, "Carry on, old boy, you're doing fine." Then silence and a belch in the RT. They were both drinking brandy, the very idea. "All right, my friends, I'll show you." I put on full left bank and jerked the stick. I heard a terrific oath and ping. The breaking of glass and the smell of brandy permeated the machine. Well, I suppose I had to be content with this sniff. I righted the machine and pushed the nose well down. The result was that both the gunner and Brinos bumped their heads against the roof. "That's enough," I heard from behind. So I'd taken the wind out of their sails. "The rest will follow when we get downstairs," I said curtly, and asked for a new course. The bomber stream was approaching Friedrichshafen. Brinos led me to my next opponent. In the middle of the operation, he said, "Don't get so excited, old boy. I've just won the Iron Cross and it must be celebrated. The main thing is that you're on the ball." I did not reply. A bare 20 minutes later, our second bomber fell like a flaming torch into Lake Constance. But now the carpet of bombs was falling on the Zeppelin city. The targets were the Dornier Works, the Zeppelin Company, the Maybach Works, and the Cogwheel Factory. 40,000 incendiaries and 4,700 HE bombs were dropped that night on Friedrichshafen, destroying 2/3 of the city. After completing their work of destruction, the formations flew west over Lake Constance towards Switzerland. Once more I glanced at the burning city and the blood-red waters of Lake Constance. There was no time to lose. The Tommy was gaining height and was very fast now with his empty bomb bays. Brinos reported, "Skipper, it's strictly forbidden to fly over Switzerland. The Swiss flak has orders to shoot at any target, whether English, American or German." "Oh, to hell," interrupted Marley. "If the British can do it, so can we. Let's make the Swiss a present of a nice fat kill. It will be good for them to learn a little of what war's like." I let the two go on with their discussion and went on chasing the enemy to the west. Brinos reported, "Contact directly ahead, the bombers in a steep dive." Searchlights suddenly went on in the distance. The Tommy made for them. Slowly I closed in, until I was within 800 yards. The searchlight battery was not far away, and in its sheaf of beams I recognized the silhouette of the enemy plane. Another 4-engined Lancaster. The searchlights went off, but I could still see the Britisher in the dark and approached until his tail was in my sights. At 100 yards our tracers crossed. I could hear the bullets rattling on my machine, and a little later there was a smell of burning in the cabin. At this point Marla roared, "We're on fire! The port engines are light." As though stung by a tarantula, I raised myself in my seat, broke away instinctively in a dive, and closed the firecock. A burst of full throttle to burn up the last fuel in the lead, ignition off and stationary prop. Nervously I watched the burning engine. Had a British night fighter been in the neighbourhood, our last hour would have come. But the bomber must have been pleased to be rid of us. In the midst of this excitement, 20 to 30 searchlights went on, and we were suddenly lit up as in broad daylight. No orientation was possible. I went into a spin. I stared in terror at the threatening searchlight cone. "Fire a distress signal, or we shall crash," I shouted to the crew, trying to get my aircraft once more under control. But it was impossible. Not until the searchlight switched off on seeing our signal did I get her once more on an even keel. We had dived 3,000 feet, and the electric altimeter showed only 4,500. A pretty business. I cursed those Swiss down below. In the meantime, the fire had gone out in the engine, so we were not so unlucky after all. But hardly had I been flying level for a few seconds than the Swiss turned on their searchlights again. Presumably my snow-white machine was a good object for their target practice. Marley immediately fired one more distress signal, for he was terrified that we should crash. We were far too low. The Swiss batteries switched off, fired green flares, and lit up the airfield. It was a peremptory order to land, but we did not intend to give up so easily. We worked according to plan. Marla fired green flares, which meant that we wanted to land. The men below replied with green flares and switched the airfield lights on and off as a sign that they had understood. Now, if only my second engine had been in action. In a breathtaking power dive, I should have skimmed over the searchlight battery and flown at treetop level in a northerly direction. With 2 engines it would have been simple, but my port engine propeller was stationary, and I was thankful that my crate was still in the air. Nevertheless, I tried to turn north and get out of the searchlight zone. But the Swiss noticed my turn and switched on so brazenly that I was terrified. This time Marley fired red flares until the barrel of the pistol was hot, but the Swiss were obstinate. I did my best to keep the machine in level flight, but it was too difficult. The glaring cone blinded me, and in a few seconds I lost all sense of gravity. Once more we dived and were looking into the sinister eyes of the searchlights. Fire red, red, Marle, or else we've had it. The machine began to whistle, a gruesome sound. At last the Swiss switched off. For a second I was still blind, and then I recognized the illuminated airfield, far behind me. I pulled the machine out before it was too late. I was lucky. The electric altimeter showed a bare 1,000 feet. Now we could not afford to play any more monkey tricks unless we wanted to crash. Once more Marley shot green, and the Swiss replied contentedly with the same signal. I made a wide circle, for to take off again with one engine would have been dangerous. The airfield looked wonderful as the flare path lights slipped beneath us. The machine sank lower and touched down in a perfect landing near the first white lamp. How marvellous to be on terra firma once more, even though it was Swiss soil. For the moment, we were safe. The airfield lights went out as soon as we were down. Ahead of us it was pitch dark, and we were still taxiing at 50 mph into the blue. I switched on my own searchlight and recognized some 4-engined bombers ahead, American Boeings. The flying fortresses were parked close together. Then the Swiss blinded me with a strong searchlight right in my face. I could see nothing and pressed with all my weight on the brakes so as not to crash into the Boeings. Presumably the Swiss feared that at the last moment I should take off again, but that was impossible with only one engine. Slowly, C9. ES came to a standstill. Suddenly a figure appeared close to me on the wing. I pulled open the cockpit roof and was about to say something when I felt a revolver in my neck. I was dumbfounded. "You're on Swiss soil," the man on the wing shouted in my ear. "Make no attempt to escape, or I shall have to use my weapon." What a pity, I thought, that my engines are out of action. It would have given me the greatest pleasure to sweep the man and his revolver off the wing by giving her full throttle. But it was no use, so I obeyed. Now we knew where we were, in Zurich-Dubendorf. Somewhat depressed, we got out of the machine. We had quickly stowed our secret documents in our pockets and waited for a favourable opportunity to destroy them. Brinos came face to face with a Swiss soldier with fixed bayonet. He was horrified. "Put that horrible knife away," he said to the conscientious soldier. The man must have had some respect for an officer's cap, for he stood at ease and lowered his rifle. Marley and I could not help laughing, and the spell was broken. The Swiss officer, now reassured, put away his revolver and offered us cigarettes. We were driven to the mess in a Mercedes. A reception seemed to be taking place, for, despite the late hour, an air hostess in a red evening dress received us and saw to it that we had food, clothes, and quarters for the night. The food was magnificent, but far too rich for our stomachs, which had been ruined by wartime fare. There was great activity in the next-door rooms. I asked the Swiss officer what was going on. "Oh, they're your colleagues from the other side who force-landed here during the day. I suppose you heard about today's big raid on the ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt. The boys left a lot of their tail feathers behind. Over 100 planes were shot down by the German fighters, and 9 force-landed here, some with shot-up engines, some with half a tail, and others with wounded aboard. Now they're celebrating the end of the war for them. They are to be interned in Switzerland." This was bitter news to me. Spend the rest of the war in Switzerland. Not on my life. First, we must get rid of the secret documents. After the good meal, we all felt a sudden urge to visit the lavatory, but the Swiss guard did not leave our sides and stood outside the door, which had to remain open. The 3 of us sat in the cabins, thinking how we could get rid of the documents. It was a long session, and the guard began to grow impatient. At a favourable moment I took the papers from my knee pocket and flung them into the pan. A good pull on the chain, and they had disappeared forever. My 2 comrades must have done likewise, for we all left the place looking visibly relieved. In the meantime, the Americans had learnt of our presence and greeted us with the greatest cordiality. They slapped us on the back as though we were their best friends and offered us champagne. "You damned Messerschmitt guys! Why are you fighting for Hitler? Hitler kaputt! Germany kaputt! Everything kaputt!" We let the Americans go on talking, smoked their Chesterfields, and offered them our German cigarettes in exchange. They were rather surprised that we still had anything to smoke and accepted them eagerly, but after the first few puffs spat them out and called them stinking weeds. The strong Virginia tobacco made my head swim. I put out my cigarette and refused the offer of others. "Cigarette no good?" asked one of the captains. I laughed and replied, "Cigarette good, too good." The Yankees laughed uproariously. The Swiss officers were delighted that the pilots of the 2 warring nations should be on such good terms. A Swiss colonel soon appeared to interrogate us. We were taken separately into his office. The interrogation did not last long. The colonel asked, "From which airfield did you take off, and what unit do you belong to?" "Such questions are useless, Colonel," I replied. "You will receive no information from me or my crew. We want to get back to Germany as quickly as possible. Please be good enough to notify our military attaché." The colonel had presumably expected this reply, for he gave us permission to retire. From this moment onwards, we were not allowed to communicate with each other. The windows of our sleeping cells were barred, and a Swiss guard stood outside the door. Thoroughly exhausted, I slumped on my bed and was soon fast asleep. Next morning, I needed some time to take in my new surroundings. I did not see my crew all day. The necessary formalities were being carried out, and we were taken for a further interrogation. The Swiss were polite and correct, but I could not help feeling a trifle anxious. The second day passed in endless waiting. My companions knocked on the walls of their respective cells, and I devised a plan of escape, for I had no wish to remain in Switzerland. But on the 3rd day of our internment, we were taken by train under close guard to Bern. It was an agreeable surprise when we were given rooms in the Hotel Metropole, and the uniformed guards were replaced by a civilian called Fuchs. The German general consul paid us a visit. We had to get out of our uniforms immediately, for in international Bern they might have given rise to unpleasant incidents. 3 night fighters in tattered Luftwaffe uniforms were taken to a store and emerged half an hour later as dapper civilians. The German consul paid for our uniforms and gave us a considerable sum of pocket money. We wandered round the city like harmless Swiss citizens. Everything that had long since disappeared in Germany was to be had in full measure in the shops. Cinemas, cabarets, dance halls and baths were open until late at night. Released from the tension of war and revived by the warm spring air, we enjoyed our liberty to the full. At this juncture, just as we were beginning to feel really well, our polite custodian Fuchs told us that within the next few days we were going to be exchanged for 3 Britishers. 3 British officers had escaped from a German prison camp in Italy and had asked for asylum in Switzerland. Nothing, therefore, prevented the exchange of 3 Germans for 3 of our enemies. At the end of May 1944, our convalescence in the golden Swiss cage came to an end. The German military attaché, the general consul, and a few German families saw us off at the station. As the train steamed out of the station and our friends were waving, Marley shouted out of the window, "Keep our rooms ready. We shall soon be back." Even the Swiss officers laughed and waved to us. Back in the homeland a new life begins, as the song says. Yes, with air raid warnings and blacked-out trains in the direction of Berlin. At the frontier, 10,000 Swiss cigarettes were handed to me as a present from the German consul. They would be a boon to the fellows in the squadron. In Berlin, the general officer commanding was waiting to hear our report. We were still in mufti. The German told us what had happened behind the scenes during our absence. I learnt the following. Hardly 9 hours after my forced landing in Zurich, the Gestapo appeared in Homburg, Altenburg and Breslau to interrogate our respective families. A short house search, various photos and letters impounded, the houses closed with an official seal, and an hour later our families were under arrest at Gestapo headquarters. Himmler had worked promptly and efficiently. On the same day, 2 men in civilian clothes with diplomatic passports left the capital for Zurich and Berne. One of them had been instructed to blow up my plane, and the other to put an end to my earthly existence with a well-aimed bullet. Our families were pestered with questions and squeezed dry as lemons. As nothing came of the interrogations, the officials grew cynical and locked them up. The food was disgusting, the cells filthy and stinking. There was no water. The staff of No. 1 Fighter Division soon heard of the events in Berlin. The telephone rang furiously, and Goering flew into a rage when he heard of Himmler's actions. The head of the secret police remained unmoved but withdrew the orders for arrest and shooting. The SS Führer, who, disguised as a civilian, was to kill me, was stopped by an express telegram at the frontier. But the second man with orders to blow up the machine had already crossed the frontier. On the 3rd day of our internment, my C-9, ES blew up, under mysterious circumstances, on the airfield of Zurich-Dubendorf. On the 7th day of my internment, my family was released, after having given their word in writing that they would never breathe a word of what had happened. I was dumbfounded when I heard of this. I telephoned home immediately to console my parents. Next day we left Berlin and were flown to Haguenau in Alsace. The whole squadron was out to greet us. It was a happy reunion. When I finally produced the packets of cigarettes and distributed them, the mood was very high in our night fighter wing No. 6. We gossiped late into the night. I decided to pay a visit to my family in Homburg. It was a happy occasion, but I found them all very subdued. This sudden arrest and detention in a Gestapo gaol had upset their nerves, particularly since they were not told the reason for their arrest. Neither the party nor the government had considered it necessary to apologize for the mistake. Only the general officer commanding Berlin had expressed his regret for the behavior of the Gestapo. On my return to Haguenau, I took over my old flight. My regular radio operator, Feldwebel Grashoff, who had been recalled from leave on account of our trip to Switzerland, was delighted to see me back. That same evening we took off to attack the RAF bombers who were raiding Frankfurt. At the beginning of June 1944, our transfer to Szombathely in Hungary came like a bolt from the blue. I had never heard the name before, but the German frontiers had changed so radically that we were no longer surprised at hearing Budapest called a German citadel, and our brothers and sisters in the Batschka referred to as citizens who have returned to the Great Reich. A fellow pilot maintained that Szombathely was a suburb of Vienna, about half an hour from Grinzing. Moreover, Hungary was the land of golden tokay, fiery paprika, and temperamental Julishkas. What should we be hunting there at night? Although we knew nothing for certain, rumours sprang up like asparagus in spring rain. I gave no thought as to the why and wherefore, and looked forward to this trip to Hungary after my official visit to Switzerland. In Szombathely, Steinemanger in German, we were under the CO, 1st Fighter Division, Oberst Handrich. He was just the type of CO we liked, a good sportsman, friendly, and always on the side of his pilots. He initiated us into our new tasks, the protection of Vienna and Budapest against RAF raids from Italy, and combats with the night-flying partisan aircraft from the east. Whereas in the west, the night fighter arm had been broken up and gone over to free-for-all, the so-called wild boar, we were still flying here according to the old system. Days of waiting passed. There was nothing doing on those warm, clear Hungarian nights. Night after night we sat in our huts waiting for the fish to nibble at the bait. The mood of the pilots and the ground staff sank to zero. Some spoke of exile and others of convalescence. On one of these boring evenings, the CO brought us a model of the Mitchell, an American aircraft. We looked at this bird from all angles and shrugged our shoulders. Yes, that's the crate in which the Russians will soon be paying us a visit, declared the CO. The Mitchell is a twin-engined fighter of great quality, fast, easy to handle and heavily armed. On closer inspection, I noticed that it bore a surprising resemblance to our Do-217, which had recently been put into service as a night fighter. By chance, a night fighter squadron was stationed in Budapest, equipped with these aircraft. The CO switched off the light, lit a candle, and projected the shadow of the Mitchell onto the ceiling. It was exceedingly difficult to distinguish the American from the German. The wings were very much alike. Both of them had small bodies and double tail units. Finally, the Mitchell had an engine stagger. In other words, the tail of the engines protruded over the wings. This was the only way of distinguishing between friend and foe. The night fighter CO from Budapest had already phoned us up in some anxiety. "So, gentlemen," said the CO, bringing his lecture to an end, "be careful of our brothers in the Dobso 217s, and don't fire until you're quite sure that you've recognised the type." The model of the Mitchell was passed round. Oberleutnant Sapp Kraft, an ambitious go-getter, stoutly maintained that any child could distinguish between the two machines. Another evening of waiting. The sultry summer air made the crews feel lazy. They sat outside in deck chairs, listening to a pep talk speech from Goebbels. In the meantime, the veterans exchanged stories of the good old days in the West. "Yes, those were the days. Here in Hungary our crates are getting rusty." The hours passed. A storm piled up in the southeast. It was probably over Lake Balaton. From hearsay we knew that these summer thunderstorms in Hungary were very dangerous. Shortly before midnight the telephone rang. The adjutant casually took up the receiver, expecting a pointless conversation, but the crew was on its feet at once as he replied, "Yes, Herr Major, a machine reported presumably a partisan supply aircraft. One machine to be dispatched to Sector Cancer." The Cancer sector was in the direction of the thunderstorm. Who was to take off? Flying conditions were not good, for the storm clouds reached 24,000 feet with 80 mph winds. The choice fell on me. At 00.10 hours I took off with my crew, Oberfeldwebel Mahler and Feldwebel Grashoff, in the direction of Lake Balaton. I did not have to gain much height, for the reported machine was at 6,000 feet. The pallid moonlight lit up the outlines of the storm clouds. Lightning flashes rent this monster, turning the bank of clouds to an electric blue. I turned away to the west and flew round the bad weather in a wide circle. In this way I had delayed my entrance into the Cancer sector. Finally, we were in communication with the ground station. We were given orders to wait, and the arrival of another night fighter from Budapest, a Do-17, was reported. This might turn out to be amusing. "Well, boys, look out when we spot the enemy," I said to the crew, turning on a course southwest from Lake Balaton. A good hour passed. The partisan supply aircraft, in the meantime, must have landed with its weapons, ammunition, and radio apparatus, and would soon be on the way back. The storm clouds moved further westwards and closed my way to my own airfield. Then the ground station reported the enemy on the return flight. I was given the course and switched on my SN2. The ground station warned again, Do-217 still in your sector. What's the point of this lunacy? I asked myself, and hoped that we should not ram our friends. Grashoff had now picked up the target on his radar and was leading me towards it. The enemy was flying at great speed and keeping a straight course. By its behaviour, it could be a Russian. At full throttle, we closed in, 500, 300, 100, and there he was. I dived and bobbed up below the opponent. His wings and body showed up very clearly against the sky. A Mitchell! Swiftly I loaded my guns and prepared for the attack. At that moment the ground station called again. "Friendly aircraft quite close to you." In great excitement the fighter directing officer called, "Achtung, Achtung, white thrush from Cancer. Be careful of friend. Do not shoot until you have recognized the enemy." This fellow down below was making me nervous. Could it be the Do-217? My wireless operator was also in doubt. It's obviously a Do-217 and not a Mitchell. The Russian wouldn't fly so nonchalantly in this neighborhood. I peered out to try and recognize the two staggered engines. I saw them, so it was a Mitchell. My gunner Mahler had not the slightest doubt. "Have a go at him," he shouted. I was still not quite convinced. Rather than shoot down one of our own night fighters, I preferred to forego a kill. What was to be done? I gained height and got in formation position at a respectful distance from the plane. Who knows? The other crew must have spotted me by now, but it did nothing. I switched on my navigating lights, green, red, and white, and dipped my wings. It took no notice. Only when I fired 3 green stars did the other pilot go into a steep right-hand turn and disappear like lightning. Now I knew for certain that it was a Mitchell and streaked after it. But the pursuit was fruitless. The machine was too fast. Neither the ground station nor my sparker picked him up again. What on earth had he thought when I flew in formation with him with my navigating lights on? Possibly he thought that another supply plane was having a little game with him. Slightly irritated, I made for home. The storm lowered dangerously ahead of me. My only alternative was to land in Budapest, but I did not feel inclined to do this. I therefore decided to fly blind through the broad storm zone. My course led over Lake Balaton in the direction of Tobolka to Szombathely. My altitude of 6,000 feet ruled out any danger of crashing into the Kakony Hills. About 6 miles from Lake Balaton, I entered the gigantic cloud bank. What happened next, I shall never forget. In a flash, we were swallowed up in pitch-black darkness. The outside temperature sank swiftly to freezing point. The rain lashed against the windscreen and reduced my visibility to nil. From now on, I had to rely on my blind flying instruments: artificial horizon, spirit level, altimeter compass, airspeed indicator, and variometer. To have a better view of the instruments, I lowered the seat and registered my entrance into the storm cloud on the instrument panel clock. My crew was now relying upon me, for they could do nothing. The deeper we penetrated the bad weather zone, the more the machine was buffeted by the strong wind. Time and time again I had to bring her back on an even keel. Then something happened which I have only once experienced in night flying. It was pitch black around us, and the lightning lit up the rain clouds. Then blue lights lashed against my windscreen, slowly at first and then in unbroken sequence. This blue, harsh light outlined the whole machine from the wingtips over the engines to the armour-plated nose. A little blue flame appeared on the points of the aerials, and the propeller blades were clearly outlined with a blue circle of light. We were all terrified. I was so spellbound by this natural phenomenon that I could not take my eyes off the blue lights. The machine shuddered beneath the gusts of wind. I forced myself to watch my instruments, since to stall in this witch's cauldron would mean certain death, but the St. Elmo's fire kept catching my eye. My clock registered 7 flying minutes, so I must have passed the hub of the storm. Slowly the blue lights vanished. The gusts calmed down, and now only the rain lashed the white outlines of my me. 1:10. The radio operator called our airfield and was told that the weather was clear there. Grasshoff switched off his transmission and went onto the beam. The little pointer wobbled systematically from left to right, a sign that we were on the right course. Half an hour later, we landed at Szombathely. My pals had naturally been listening into our conversations during the ops and pulled my leg after I had reported to the CO. I gave him a completely accurate report and told him of my experience with the Mitchell. Oberleutnant Sepp Kraft shook his head and said woefully that such a thing could never have happened to him. A Mitchell was as easy to distinguish from a Do-217 as a horse from an ox. "Probably in daylight, bright boy," I replied. A few days later, I was proved right. On the night of 26th June 1944, the British attacked the Hungarian capital from Italy. The bombers were already reported over the Adriatic, when at 22:45 hours we took off from our airfield. North of Baja, and therefore a long way from the capital, we met the British bomber stream and decimated it. Only a few bombs fell on Budapest, causing a few paltry fires. Our wing shot down 16 of the enemy. During this attack, Oberleutnant Sepp Kraft shot down 2 bombers, a Vickers Wellington and a Mitchell. We were rather surprised. A Mitchell from Italy. It did not seem possible. The thick end of the stick came later. Budapest called and asked whether our fighters had shot down a Do-217 by mistake. There was an icy silence. The CO compared the time of the incident in the operational report with the time of the shooting down of the Dumba 217. It could only have been Kraft's Mitchell. The times agreed precisely, and also the site of the crash. Fortunately, the crew of 4 managed to escape from the burning machine, thus saving him from a court-martial. Kraft was depressed. I could not help indulging in a little malicious pleasure and said, "Well, old man, you mistook the ox for a horse." Once more it was a case of he who laughs last laughs loudest. Nevertheless, the success of that night cheered up both the pilot and the ground crews. The crisis was over. We were ready for new deeds. During the next ops, we were to lose one of our best pilots, Oberleutnant Wolfgang Knieling. Knieling, a magnificent night fighter, distinguished himself in particular in the Battle of Berlin. In an air combat over the German capital, he was hit by a flak burst. Badly wounded, he landed the heavily damaged machine with his last strength, saving the lives of his wounded wireless operator and gunner. On landing, he fainted through loss of blood. The ambulance was quickly on the spot and took him to hospital. After months on his sickbed, he returned to our wing. On his arrival, a telegram was waiting for him from home. His young wife had presented him with a daughter. He was thrilled. The sirens wailed at midnight. A British formation was flying over Croatia in the direction of Vienna. We scrambled for our machines and were airborne within a few minutes. Knieling hobbled to his dispersal pen on his gammy leg. The engines were revved up, and in a few minutes the wing was in the air in strength, 30 machines. It was a free-for-all. Each of us flew towards his own destiny. The British skimmed over the Alps in order to escape our radar. At this altitude, near the icy peaks, I spotted by chance a Vickers Wellington. It was 30 minutes after I had taken off. The Tommy must have seen me, for he streaked towards the mountains to shake me off. I knew that pursuit would be very dangerous, for each moment a rocky wall could loom ahead. But the British pilot gambled everything on one card and went down lower into the valley. On both sides of me, the mountains were now higher than my wings. Suddenly a huge column of flame rose ahead of me. The bomber must have crashed straight into a cliff. The flames lit up the neighbouring mountains. At the moment of his impact, I zoomed in order to escape a similar fate. The ground station gave me my position, Schneeberg, with a peak of 6,250 feet. This mountain had proved disastrous to the British crew. Strange, a kill without a round of ammunition having been fired. The pursuit went on. All round me burning machines were hurtling down into this world of ice. The ground station reported once more. Attack on Sankt Pölten in progress. 8 minutes later, we picked up a second Vickers Wellington in our radar. The bomber was flying peacefully towards its target and was not far away. The bombs were still in its bays. I attacked immediately and fired with all my guns into the fuselage. The British bomber stream was broken up before it reached Sankt Pölten, and its bombs fell at random on the city. On the return journey, I had no luck. The Tommies, impressed by their losses, hedge-hopped for home. Oberleutnant Knieling was pursuing one of them. A bitter combat developed above the mountain peaks. Knieling sent his final message. "Pock! Pock!" I, too, was watching the exchange of fire, not far ahead. The British pilot replied with tracers. The bursts crossed each other. A short pause and another burst. The Tommy struggled desperately. Knieling gave him no quarter and sprayed him with a rain of fire. Suddenly both machines were on fire. The bomber went down in a power dive and crashed. Kenealing remained with his machine on fire for a while in the air, then crashed quite close to his quarry. I circled over the spot, but there was no hope. The burning wreckage lay at 6,000 feet in a world of ice and snow. After the attack on Sankt Pölten, calm reigned in the air by night. Had the losses been too heavy for the Allies, or were they preparing a new offensive? The latter must have been true. There was great activity in Warsaw, where the small German garrison was faced with strong forces of Polish partisans. A revolt could break out at any moment, but the partisans were in need of weapons and ammunition. But how were they to get them? The overland route was closed, and they could only be brought in by air. The British prepared a big airlift from Foggia to Warsaw. Formations of Halifaxes and Lancasters were sent from the British Isles to Italy. Preparations were underway, but weeks elapsed before this airlift started. The Luftwaffe command had known this, and so transferred some of the crews to the west. I was among them and left on 17 July 1944 for St. Trond in Belgium. The flight was from Hungary over Austria and Germany and took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Here was stationed the night fighter wing commanded by Hauptmann Schnaufer, the ace of the German night fighter arm. After Oberleutnant Lent, Hauptmann Schnaufer was the second night fighter pilot to win the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, just about the time that Lent and his crew were killed in such tragic circumstances. Schnaufer was considered by the English bomber crews as their worst bogey. At that time they called him the Spook of St. Trond. Night after night they sent special crews in mosquitoes to put an end to his activities. Before the British bombers left the British Isles, these mosquito formations left for St. Trond to sow chaos among the Schnaufer wing by low-level attacks on their grounded aircraft. But the stout Swabian always managed to lead the Tommies by the nose. He was always the first to take off and pursue the bombers on their run-in. His crew was infected by his youthful energy and courage, which had raised the number of kills in No. 4 Night Fighter Group No. 1 to more than 700. His go-getting energy together with great flying skill and cunning led to successes that were unsurpassed in the history of the Second World War. Schnaufer never spared himself. Thus he took off one night alone when a thick fog had reduced visibility to nil. His audacity paid dividends, for he shot down 4 British bombers. He had a unique success during a raid on Stuttgart. A bomber stream in close formation flew over the Swabian capital. Schnaufer inveigled his way into the stream, sending one bomber after the other into the depths. He was soon up with the leaders. Just before reaching Stuttgart, a machine broke away from the stream. It was the Master of Ceremonies. Schnaufer's wireless operator picked up the machine in his radar. Schnaufer knew that on the success of this combat depended the life of his crew, the life of many of the Stuttgarters, and the life of the city itself. He decided to attack, but it took him a long time to close in. There was a smile on his face. He knew what he was up against, for a Master of Ceremonies was something in the nature of an impregnable fortress. The most carefully chosen gunners sat in these bombers to give their wing leader an undisturbed approach flight to the target. The best radio operators watched the air with special radar apparatus. No surprise attack was possible against these crews. Long before the night fighter came out of the dark, they had spotted him. They knew his direction, speed, and altitude within a few seconds. The smallest change of course did not escape the English radar operators, who immediately notified the experienced gunners. Schnaufer knew all this, but his ambition did not allow him to hesitate. The Tommy must be brought down. His operator kept giving him the distance. The approach went according to plan, for the Britisher was cruising peacefully. Distance 900, 800, 700 yards, aircraft at one altitude directly ahead. Now even our cool-headed Schnaufer was excited. 600, 500, 400, courier straight ahead. Schnaufer removed the safety catch, and his right thumb was now on the firing button. He knew that by now the Britishers' guns were probably trained on him. Distance 300, 200, 150 yards. The operator had hardly given this last report than the crew went nearly crazy with terror. Dazzling flare bombs lit up the machine as bright as day. A piece of shrapnel went through the cabin and tore the radar out of the wireless operator's hands. Schnaufer reacted as quick as lightning and broke away. This saved his life. The tracers streaked away over the cabin, but the Britisher had shown his teeth. Slowly the pilot ran his hand over his eyes to banish the blindness caused by the flash bombs. His eyes grew accustomed to the darkness once more. The master of ceremonies must still be very close, and at any second the storm could break again. "What a bloody business," said Schnaufer into the RT. "What are we going to do without our radar? Good thing he's flying on a steady course. Perhaps we'll still spot him." The seconds passed. A slipstream caught his machine and flung it downwards like a scrap of paper. Schnaufer righted her immediately, pushed the throttle full home, and suddenly saw his opponent's slender fuselage and broad wings loom out of the darkness.